Just before we leave Klein, I looked through the list of concepts and I realized there's one very important concept and issue that I didn't address last week, and that's the whole issue of the death instinct. Freud posited this idea in 1920 in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and when he first advanced the idea of a death instinct, he really seemed to, he did advance it as a biologically grounded hypothesis. Here's the drive. It's a death drive. He defines the drive as something rooted in a somatic source. So this is a biologically grounded instinct to die. I don't think it's been widely recognized, but I've always seen this as his break with Darwin. Because, of course, as I pointed out, he grew up under the aegis of Darwinism. The Origin of Species was published 3 years after he was born. His teachers were passionate Darwinists, man is an animal. And from a Darwinian point of view, a death instinct makes no sense whatsoever. Because from a Darwinian point of view, it's about life. It's about the survival. So here he is positing a death instinct. This is a break with Darwin in significant ways. The other thing he does is he advances his two new drives, Eros and Thanatos, with capitalized Greek names. Eros, Thanatos. It's like he's describing gods or metaphysical principles. In a certain way, one can see this as a break with his early psychobiology and his positivism, and his move into something much more like metaphysics almost. He's moving into philosophy here. Of course, he was constantly saying hostile things about philosophy, but here he's moving into philosophy in a significant way. And he knows this, because he knows that his Eros Thanatos is a repeat of what the pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles had said. Empedocles saw all of life as the outcome of a conflict between philia and nikos, love and strife. So all reality is a manifestation of a conflict. Freud is saying something very similar here. Most analysts rejected the concept of a death instinct. Didn't make sense to them. What they did was they translated death instinct into aggressive drive, which is not what Freud meant. For Freud, even in 1920, aggression is not an independent drive, it's outwardly deflected death instinct. What's primary is masochism, and by masochism I mean here the wish to die. So the death instinct is primary masochism, but under the influence of Eros, which wants us to live, the death instinct is deflected away from the self, outward onto others, as an aggressive drive. So that means that aggression is secondary to masochism. This is a reversal of what Freud had thought earlier on, in certain ways. Anyway, the mainstream translated death instinct into aggressive instinct, and this was very neat because now you had the baby is born, all id, with drives, a sex drive and an aggressive drive. That's what certainly the Americans did with it, and many of the Europeans did with Freudian theory as well, just basically sidestepping the whole idea of a death instinct. Klein apparently is one of the exceptions. She seems to endorse the concept of the death instinct, and the idea of the death instinct in the minds of many people is very much associated with Kleinian analysis. Kleinians often use the word death instinct, death drive. But when you actually look at the Kleinian literature, you never know what a Kleinian means by the term death drive or death instinct, except by carefully studying the context in which they use it. Very rarely do they seem to mean by death instinct what Freud meant by it, a biologically based instinct to die. They mean many other things. Sometimes they mean human destructiveness. Sometimes they mean a death wish. Now, a death wish is very different than a death drive. A death wish is a psychological thing. We see death wishes all the time. Wishes for other people's deaths, wishes for my own death. That's psychology. That's not the same thing as a death drive that's rooted in a biological need. Sometimes by death instinct, the Kleinians seem to mean annihilation anxiety, the fear of being annihilated. But that would only be because aggressiveness has been projected out, and now it's coming back at me in a way that feels like it's threatening to annihilate me. So annihilation anxiety is a very different concept certainly than Freud's idea of a death instinct. So in the Kleinian literature, when you encounter the word death instinct, you've got to pay very careful attention to try to figure out what the heck this author means by it, because very often it's not at all obvious what is meant by the term. Well, what about Mrs. Klein herself? She does use the words death instinct, and this is one of the two explanations that she gives as to why the baby will always be paranoid, will always have persecutory anxiety, no matter how good and attuned and empathic the caretakers are. No mother can rescue the baby from being paranoid. She gives two explanations as to why. One is that the baby is saddled with a death instinct, and the baby has to project it out. And so he projects the death instinct into the breast, and now feels paranoid, he feels persecuted, he feels that he's being attacked by a predator. The all bad part object of the paranoid schizoid position is loaded with the death instinct that I project out. And so this destructive thing is coming back at me. I'm paranoid. That's one explanation. But wherever she gives that explanation, on I would say almost every page where she gives that explanation, she goes on to give a second explanation as to why the baby must be paranoid. Because not even the best mother in the world can save the baby from frustration. And frustration generates aggression. And the aggression will be projected, making the part object breast into a persecutor. The way Klein sometimes puts it, and Bion follows her in this, the absent good breast is felt, is experienced as a present bad attacking breast. The absent good breast is felt or experienced as a bad attacking breast. The absent good breast frustrates me, generates aggression, the aggression is projected, and I feel myself being attacked. The first of the two explanations, death instinct, has never made any sense to me. I've never accepted Freud's death instinct, and I have never accepted the death instinct as Klein when she writes those words. But her second explanation as to why babies have to be paranoid has always made sense to me. Because it doesn't matter how attuned the self-object caretaker is, there will be frustration, and there will be aggression, and the aggression will be projected, and the baby will be paranoid. And this then ties into the other big myth about Melanie Klein, which actually we'll see tonight Winnicott contributes to this myth, which is that Klein denies the role of the real mother. You hear this over and over again in the secondary literature. I personally just feel it's utterly untrue. Anyone who reads Melanie Klein will see that it's not true, because she's constantly emphasizing that the only thing that can rescue the child from its inevitable paranoia is the goodness of the real mother. It's only by taking in the goodness of the real mother that the baby's feelings of persecution can be offset. Okay, so there's the good mother in Klein over and over again. I mean, I could quote you so many passages where she says this so clearly. So where's the denial of the real mother? Now, I think if some of the people who would say this were here, they would say, yes, Don, okay, we'll grant you that she recognizes the role of the real mother and her goodness as being important, but she never talks about the bad mother. she never talks about the mother as an active agent of destruction. She talks about the need for a good mother, but she doesn't talk about the bad mother. Maybe she doesn't enough, but I mean, I don't know how you can talk about the importance of the necessity of the good mother to offset the paranoia without implicitly acknowledging that some mothers are going to do that poorly, and some are going to do it well. In other words, a really good mother is going to very successfully offset the paranoia. A mother who is cold, absent, emotionally dead, whatever, is not going to be sufficiently a loving presence to counteract the paranoia. That's bad mothering, or inadequate mothering. So I feel that the mother really, in both of her incarnations, is there in Klein. It's true that Klein doesn't engage in mother bashing, because she understands that babies come into the world already with a temperament, with little personality. Well, personality is too much, but marked temperamental differences. And she's very well aware that a mother who is very good at offsetting 3 of her 4 babies' paranoia doesn't connect properly with the 4th child, because they just can't dance. They're all over one another's feet. They just don't connect. And that has something to do with what the baby brings to the table, not just with what the mother brings to the table. So that Kleinians, have never gotten into that thing that Bruno Bettelheim got into, the refrigerator mother as the cause of schizophrenia, that kind of thing. The Kleinians were always, as with Margaret Moll, are also always aware that severe derailments in infancy, it takes 2 to tango, and it takes 2 to not tango. And if things go really wrong, it's not just the mother. I don't know, sometimes it may be 90% the mother and 10% the infant. Sometimes it'll be 90% something going on with the infant and only 10% the mother. That's very complicated. I'm just trying to make the point that Klein was not into mother bashing. But because she was not into mother bashing, some analysts, John Bowlby in particular, accused her of just ignoring the role of the real mother in her psychology. And that's a real distortion. I like John Bowlby's work. I think he's made important contributions to psychoanalysis, but I've never been able to forgive him for spreading that particular myth. Winnicott felt the same. I mean, Winnicott was supervised by Klein. Winnicott as well. We'll see that tonight. That's really the point I wanted to make about death instinct, okay? You never know what a Kleinian means by that unless you really study carefully the context in which the term is used. And the fact that every time Klein mentions it, she gives this alternative and, to me, much preferable explanation as to why all babies have to be paranoid, and the importance of the mother in alleviating that. Okay, so then I promised to talk about Bion tonight, to some extent. Okay, where's the best place to start with Bion? I think with his work on groups, experiences in groups. So during the war, Second World War, he was a military psychiatrist, and they charged him to take over this work with people who today, I suppose, would be diagnosed with PTSD. And they were at this hospital north, I forget the name of the precise hospital, and he decides to conduct these groups. And the personnel who show up for the groups, they're thinking this is group therapy. But Bion is not understanding this as group therapy at all. He's conducting an experiment. These are called leaderless groups, because when he meets with these men, they're all expecting him to take a leadership role as group therapist. But instead, he says nothing. He sits there sucking on his pipe. in silence. And then he just watches what the group does in reaction to his abandonment of authority and leadership. So they're leaderless groups. And then he is a group analyst. He gives interpretations to the group about how they are reacting to his abandonment of authority. And he distinguishes three types of groups, which he calls basic assumption groups. Because he says one or another basic assumption, and by basic assumption he means pretty much the same thing as Klein means by a fantasy, spelt with a PH, or what sociologists would call a definition of the situation. One or the other of the three seems to emerge in different groups. The group that carries on with its task, only these particular groups don't have an assigned task, but Bion distinguishes what he calls the work group, which is a conventional group that gets together to accomplish some task. That's the work group. But when leadership is abdicated, the work group breaks down, and you have these basic assumption groups emerging. Three of them. BAD, BAF, and basic assumption, BAP. Okay, let's look at basic assumption dependency, BAD. Basic assumption dependency. The group reacts as if God has died and they are desperate for a new God. They're in quest for a new God to lead them out of the desert into the promised land. And they're putting pressure on Bion to start behaving like a proper God. And he's not doing it. They're showing all kinds of frustration and aggression towards him for abdicating his godly status. And they're sooner or later getting ready to elect someone else, some other member of the group, to take over the leadership function. The second type of group is BAF, fight-flight. The group reacts in a paranoid way that they're being attacked or they're in danger of being attacked. And again, they need a leader to lead them either in a fight or in a flight. And again, they're very frustrated with Bion because he's not that leader. And they're looking around for someone in the group who will substitute this role, leading them in the fight or the flight. And then the third type of group, BAP, is basic assumption pairing. This is kind of interesting. He abdicates, but over time, I mean, the group's floundering, but gradually what happens is two people in the group seem to be kind of hooking up. It could be a man and a woman, could be two women, could be two men, but these two are pairing. And the interesting thing is that the rest of the group is kind of fascinated with the pairing that's going on. They don't seem threatened by it. They seem to like it. They seem to be interested in the fact that these two people are getting together. As if they have a hope, an unconscious hope, that out of the connection between these two, some solution will arise that will be the salvation, that will prove to be the salvation of the group, which is floundering. Bion says it's as if the group expects that through the interaction of these two, a third will be born, a Messiah. A Messiah will be born who will lead the group into the promised land. So the group is implicitly supporting this pairing process. Okay. In terms of the other two groups, dependency and fight-flight, he says that when the group tries to find a substitute leader, substitute for Bion, they invariably choose the sickest person in the group as the new leader. He says
Which one of them they do that?
both fight, flight. They're looking for a leader to lead them in a fight or a flight, or they're just looking for a god. And the god they choose, or the leader for fight and flight, will turn out to be the sickest person in the group. He gives a list. It'll be someone who is a malignant narcissist, a psychopath, and he says in a group of 4 or 5 people, there's never any shortage of one of these.
Is that the Trump effect that you just described?
The Trump effect. There you go. There you go. Well, all right. So we can apply Bionian psychology here to our current politics. Yeah. The Trump effect. That's good. Okay. So the moral of the story is, when you're in a group and the regular leadership has failed in some way, and the group seems to be choosing so-and-so as its new leader, Bion says, be careful, because the group may be about to choose the sickest person in the group to be the substitute leader. Now, the best way to study Bion, as far as I'm concerned, is to read William Golding's Lord of the Flies. It came to your mind.
When you started breaking the 3 groups down, I was thinking, sounds like Lord of the Flies.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lord of the Flies was written before, or around the same time, but I mean, Golding, I don't think, knew of Bion's work. There are many different ways to read Lord of the Flies. One, of course, is as an allegory of the breakdown of the German Weimar Republic and the emergence of the Nazis. That's a subtext. But there's a more interesting subtext, I think. So, the boys were on a plane, and the plane crashed on this island, and all of the adults on the plane died. So the boys are, in one there's a captain who half survives and then dies. So the British made a wonderful film of this in black and white in the 1950s, and then the Americans did a Technicolor version involving the Marines as the rescue agents at the end. They're both interesting films. So here are the boys. Now they were a cadet corps. And Ralph was the leader of the cadet corps, and he and Piggy become, they try to be rational work leaders of the rational work group, the group that gets things done. And so they're taking a scientific attitude, and so they understand that if they're ever going to get off this island, they need to keep a signal fire going on the mountaintop to signal that they're there. And they're using Piggy's very thick glasses as a way of starting a fire. And Piggy has all kinds of other knowledge. Like, he knows that there are certain berries that can't be eaten. He knows that if there's wild boar, and he knows that there's certain kinds of meat that shouldn't be eaten. So he has knowledge, and so Piggy and Ralph are the rational leaders of the work group. But as time goes by, they're not getting rescued. And so the level of anxiety, especially among the younger boys, is growing. There's another leader. Because, you see, what I want to say is that Golding sees something that Bion missed. Freud learned a lot from Shakespeare. And psychoanalysts should be on the lookout to modify to expand psychoanalytic theory to include insights that literary minds have grasped that analysts haven't yet caught up with. And I think that Golding saw something here that certainly Freudian analysts hadn't caught up with. There's another leader, Simon. Simon doesn't represent rational leadership. He's gentle. He's loving. He's gentle to the animals in the forest. He looks after the dying captain until he dies. And Simon, so the psychopathic leader emerges, Jack. They start to hunt wild boar, and Jack is useful in organizing and leading the hunt. And a lot of the boys fall under the sway of Jack's rather psychopathic style of leadership, and they begin to turn away from Ralph and Peggy. Like all psychopathic leaders, Ralph knows that the way to increase his Jack knows that the way to increase his power over the boys is to increase their anxiety. It's like all of those terror alerts from yellow to whatever. Keep the population in a state of terror, and they will follow the Trumps. So Jack is spreading the myth of the monster. There's a monster on the island. And at one point, Simon understands that what they think is a monster is really the dying captain and so on. And he comes down to tell the boys. It's a Christian allegory. He's bringing the good news. Gospel means good news. Simon is Jesus. Simon is bringing the good news that we needn't be afraid. He's going to lower level. He's gentle Jesus, bringing the good news. And they kill him, of course. They kill him on the beach. He's slain before he can quite successfully deliver the good news. So that adds something that's not there in Bion. Bion is a rationalist, like Freud. Like Freud is a rationalist. These guys really believe in reason. I don't. I believe in love. I'm with Simon. Bion understood that reason won't cut it. On one level, Freud also knew that reason won't cut it. I mean, he was very aware of the limitations of reason. He was very much aware of how reason can be displaced by strong emotional forces. And in a few places, he does opt for love. As I pointed out in earlier lectures, there's that one place where Freud slips in 1914 in On Narcissism and says, unless we learn to love, we will fall ill. We must fall ill unless we learn how to love. But mostly, and at the end of Civilization and its Discontents, he says, he's talking about Thanatos, but he says, and now, hopefully, Eros, we'll hear from Eros, Thanatos' immortal enemy. That's love. So I'm not saying that the emphasis on love is absent in Freud, not at all. But Freud was quite a rationalist. I mean, in many places, Freud described the analytic goal as the establishment of a dictatorship of the intellect. A dictatorship of the ego over the superego and the id. And he says, being a dictatorship of reason, this will be a reasonable dictatorship, is what he says. And I say, do we know many dictatorships that are reasonable? He wants to establish the dominance of the intellect. And implicit in Freud is this idea of the analytic cure as a kind of enlightened hedonism. Freud is a critique of stupid hedonism, wine, women, and song. That's going to lead to pain. Freud knows that. But he celebrates an enlightened hedonism, as if what we want to produce are people who are guided both by the reality principle and the pleasure principle. Not that many people have noticed that that's a description of a successful psychopath. Psychopaths are often highly rational. They're often highly intelligent, and they're guided by the pleasure principle. They're out for number one. So, if you're going to be guided by reason, rationality, and you're out for number one, you got a psychopath.
Can you explain to me how they're rational?
They are often highly successful. They will use science, knowledge, research, cunning, to get what they want. And they're not bothered by conscience. They're not hampered by conscience. Because it used to be said psychopaths don't have a conscience. I believe they do. I just think they're extremely talented in not listening to it. They've bound it and gagged it, and they've got ironclad defenses against it.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's simply, you know, I mean, most psychopaths, unless they're like sexual psychopaths, they're not. They don't really want to kill you, but they'll happily kill you if you get in their way. They want what they want, and they're often extremely intelligent about getting it. And they're not troubled by conscience. So, I guess I don't want to be sweeping here. I just think that sometimes Freud and Bion as well put too much emphasis on rationality and reason, and they don't put quite enough emphasis on love. So I'm drawing attention to the fact that in Golding, he gives us two rational leaders, Ralph and Piggy, but he also gives us Simon. And that's an important ingredient in Lord of the Flies that really isn't there in Bion. Okay, this work on groups has been repeated all around the world, where these experiments with leadership, leaderless groups have been repeated. And especially in certain places in Britain, something that has been called socio-psychoanalysis has emerged, where people take Bion's and other ideas into a kind of psychoanalytically informed study of organizations, hospitals, business corporations. In fact, there are quite a number of psychoanalysts who've gone into the field of organizational consulting. And they're not working with patients, a lot of these people anymore. They're working with organizations, using a lot of Bion's ideas to study these irrational, regressive processes that take place in organizations, and to try to get the organization to move out of the basic assumptions back into work group functioning, where things actually can start to get done again. So I think Bion's made an important contribution in that field. Okay, another of, moving back more into more conventional psychoanalysis, another of Bion's major contributions is his whole idea of the container and the contained. And implicitly, he really radically changes the Kleinians' view of the origins of pathology. Certainly the early Kleinians sometimes wrote as if they believed that some serious psychopathology stems from the fact that certain babies and children come into the world with a powerful constitutional loading of aggression, or a powerful constitutional loading of envy. That kind of thinking is really kind of pretty much gone in modern Kleinian thought, largely due to Bion. For Bion, the origin of psychopathology is early failures of containment. Now again, it's not mother bashing, because the early containment can fail, both because the provider is not providing right, but also because the receiver isn't receiving right. So it's not mother bashing, but Bion is really saying that for proper development to occur, the baby is going to be in states of pain and distress that at times feel overwhelming, unbearable states of mind are going to be in the infant. And the infant is screaming and is doing its best to use projective identification to put those unbearable states into the mother. And the mother has to be able to take these states in and contain them and bear them. This emotional pain, Bion calls beta elements. These are raw, undigestible mental elements that the baby can't handle. And so the baby projects these beta elements out into the mother. The mother has to be able to receive them, contain them, not just hurl them back, but to contain them and process them with her, what Bion calls alpha function. By alpha function, what he really means is she has to find some way of symbolizing this material. This raw, undigestible emotional stuff has to be able to be symbolized and then handed back. And he describes this as a detoxification. It's as if the beta elements are a kind of poison, unbearable poison in the baby's mind. He can't, so he projects it out. She takes it in. She works it over with alpha function. She alpha betizes it. That is, she turns it into symbolic process of some sort. She works it over with her reverie, with her dreams, with her symboling functions. And of course, this is what the analyst does, says Bion. Freud says the analyst should get into a state of freely hovering attention, which is a state of reverie. He shouldn't be pouncing on every word. He shouldn't be listening for detail. He should be sitting back and moving back and forth between what the patient's saying and what his thoughts are and what his dreams and feelings are and what's the patient saying now, and that's reverie. The analyst should get into this state of reverie. Bion says the analyst should come to the hour in a state without memory or desire. Now, a lot of people have wasted a lot of time taking this literally, which he didn't mean it to be taken literally. He didn't mean that the analyst should come and forget who the patient is, so when the patient arrives he's never seen him before. That would be ridiculous. If I don't remember my patient, that's going to traumatize my patient. So he doesn't mean it literally, but he means that the analyst shouldn't have a big agenda and desire. He shouldn't be coming to the session with his own agenda, his own desires for what should take place in today's session. He should, in other words, he should be open. He should be open to being surprised. He should create a space, a containing space where he's receptive, to receiving what the patient brings. And he should be pretty silent at the beginning of sessions. I try. At least for the first half of the session, to have very little to say, because by my not saying anything, I'm creating a kind of a vacuum, and that vacuum sucks the stuff out of the patient. Patient starts talking, and surprising, and making slips of the tongue, and they're filling the space with their stuff now, and so the mother and the analyst are containers, and they're containing what the patient or the baby is projecting, and they're not hurling it back. They're sitting with it, they're having reverie about it, and they're working it over with alpha function and turning it into some symbolic thing that can then be, and that's detoxifying it. That's taking the poison out of it. And then, having been detoxified, the mother or the analyst can hand it back to the patient in some modified and detoxified way that the baby can take in. And the baby becomes less distressed and becomes soothed in this whole process. And so what's the origin of psychopathology? Failures of containment. This process is broken down. Okay, so the baby can't get rid of the beta elements. The baby can't have the unbearable detoxified. And so the baby's mind is filled with unbearable things. And this requires pathological defenses and leads to all the different forms of psychopathology. This is a very different theory of the origins of pathology. It's not babies coming into the world with intense envy or intense aggression or whatever. We're looking at, this is a move heavily into relational psychoanalysis. Okay? We're talking about the relation between the mother and the infant and how it can break down with pathological consequences.
Can I just ask a question?
Mhm.
Not to get too detailed about this or digressive, but what comes to mind is the Lacanian notion of the real.
Yes.
Is there a correspondence, some kind of conceptual, I'll say sisterhood about it? Since
Maybe, I
gender
don't.
is not discussed, but
Yeah, there's a wonderful article. I'm not a big fan of the work of Michael Eigen, but I do acknowledge that he wrote a great article back in the early 90s. And it was about Bion, Lacan, Bion, and someone else. Look it up, Michael Eigen. He makes some of those parallels. It's a bit dangerous. It's a bit dangerous. I mean, you'll be lucky if you can find two Lacanians who will agree on what Lacan means by the real. Okay. Basically, I think what Lacan seems to mean by the real is that which is unsymbolized, that which is not worked over by language. And there is a parallel to the idea of the beta elements, because most of Lacanians experience the real as very much like in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Kurtz utters the words, the horror, okay? And that's the real for most Lacanians.
I've always taken it to mean a kind of core anguish.
Something overwhelming,
Yeah.
something unbearable, something horrific. On the other hand, I always faulted the Lacanians for describing the real in that way. Because why isn't it also the awesome, the most beautiful? Why for the Lacanians is the real always the devil and it's never God? Until I discovered the prominent Lacanian William Richardson, who S.J. performs the Mass every Sunday, and he's a Heidegger scholar and a Hegel scholar, and he's one of the few Lacanians who describes the real as both the horrific and the ecstatically beautiful.
Jouissance.
Well, there's jouissance, right. But how jouissance connects with the real is another complicated question.
I didn't want to get too digressive.
Yeah, we're going to get too much into Lacan here, but I do think that for most Lacanians, at least those Lacanians who describe the real as the horrific, they're talking about something like beta elements that are kind of like unprocessed symbolically. There is a parallel there. There's no doubt. But then Bion also has this concept of O. And O is like ultimate reality. It's ultimate truth. And therefore it's ultimately unknowable. It's ultimately only incompletely knowable. We're always seeking it. We're always seeking this truth. But we can never completely reach it. But we can get closer. O is, Bion will talk about the O of the session. It's a little bit like that point about James Strachey saying there's a live wire in every session, and the analyst is very reluctant to grab that live wire. Bion is saying something, he's saying there is a truth in every session. And our goal is to try to get at that truth. And sometimes patient and analyst manage to hit on the O of the session, in which case they're both in the presence of truth. And that'll be when, these are fairly rare experiences, but if one day things come together in a particular session, and the analyst manages to say it in a brief and pithy way, and the patient goes silent. And they're both sitting there kind of a little bit in awe, because truth has been touched. O has been touched. Those are really therapeutic moments in an analysis, when finally, after all of the bullshit and the defenses and everything else, something has been said that rings true. Here's a slightly frivolous example of that, but our friend Doug Frayne, I remember him, this woman comes to him, she's in middle age, she's never had an orgasm. And she wants an orgasm before she dies. So he agrees to take her into analysis. So they have to work out 4 appointments. So they struggle with their schedules, and they work out a Monday time, and then they struggle, and then they work out a Tuesday time, and it's getting harder. Finally, they get a 3rd time, and then they're struggling to get the 4th session, and she's saying, no, I can't come then, I can't come then, I can't come. And he says, right, you can't come. So then she found a way to come, you know. So now that's a bit of a frivolous example, but something true was said there, right? And she felt the truth of what he was saying, and he had the courage to say it, and it made the analysis possible. She showed up for her 4 appointments. She got into analysis. So
How do you spell O?
just a big O.
Oh, okay. That's,
One big O.
oh.
That's it. The truth of the session. Bion believed that truth is the nutriment of the mind. He believes that like flowers need water, the mind needs truth. And minds that are deprived of truth grow sick. You know? I think he's right about that. Freud kind of agreed with that to a considerable degree too. Freud was all very much in favor of truth values. Bion distinguishes between what he calls K and minus K. Okay, K is genuine, valid knowledge, knowing in a valid sense, but minus K is flight from knowledge, or it's wrong knowledge, or it's lies. And that's a big theme in Bion, the distinction between truth and lies. And Bion contributes, I think, one way of understanding Bion's work is that it's a very interesting kind of detailed study of what the Freudians would call resistance. It's how certain patients systematically undermine truth, evade truth, bury truth, destroy truth. Okay? And so whenever I'm talking about that aspect of Bion's thought, I think back to a seminar that I conducted at the university with graduate students, I don't know, many, many years ago. It was probably the best seminar. I was only a few years older at that time than the graduate students were, and they were a very bright bunch, you know. There were about 8 or 9 of us, and we just met in my office, and you know, everyone was participating in creative ways, and we were making meaning together. We were in sync, and we were making meaning. And there was this one guy in the seminar, and the more that we were making progress in thinking together about important things, the more depressed and ill he looked. Okay? He was just getting, he was feeling persecuted more and more by the fact that we were doing this. Now I'll come back to explaining in Bionian terms why. But anyway, it was at a certain point this guy couldn't take it anymore, and he would open up. And stuff would come out of his mouth that I don't think anyone could understand, but it was like a green gas that filled the room. And we all just got depressed. We completely lost the creative thing that had been happening in the group. He just destroyed it. We all just got depleted and depressed and couldn't function. I had to ask him to leave the seminar. He was killing it. You know, we picked it up again after I kicked him out. So he was persecuted. Okay, here's how Bion would explain why he was persecuted. Bion offers us a theory of thinking, and he wrote a book called Learning from Experience, and he asks, well, how do we learn from experience? How do we grow psychically? And again, he kind of applies a version of the container-contained model. He says that mental growth involves a preconception leading to a realization, leading to a conception. So he says that thinking is a matter of linking. Okay, you link a preconception up with a realization, and out of that linking generates a third thing. It's like he's saying, and baby makes three. He's thinking that productive thinking is like fucking. It's a form of intercourse. It's mental intercourse. Okay? So, if you can't stand being present when productive intercourse is happening, see, for the Freudians, that's a primal scene. See, if I'm watching a couple having intercourse, I'm the excluded third. And I can't stand it. Like if I've got an unresolved Oedipal problem, I can't stand people getting it on. Okay? I can't stand it because I feel like the traumatized and excluded third. And I have intense envy that this couple are coupling. And it isn't me. And therefore, if I hate couples, and if I hate coupling, I can't couple with myself in my mind. I can't link in my own mind. Because I hate couples getting together productively so much, I can't allow things in my own mind to come together productively. Therefore, I can't have new thoughts. Therefore, I can't learn from experience. Therefore, I can't grow psychologically. It's like he's moving the Oedipus complex into the mind. And he's seeing psychopathology as a tax on linking. Because linking has this connotation of productive intercourse. Two coming together to generate a third thing. Now you can work over that in Hegelian terms if you want. Thesis, antithesis, generating a synthesis. I mean, I think that productive dialectical thinking does require the overcoming of an Oedipal problem. Because you've got to let the two come together to generate the third thing. Bion is essentially saying that.
You also have to get off on it, too.
You have to get off on it, instead of feeling oppressed by it. And that guy was oppressed by it. We were all getting off on it. We were having amazing intercourse with one another in that seminar. We were all turned on mentally. And he couldn't stand it. I think it felt to him like he was at an orgy. He couldn't take it. I mean, I'm laughing. I feel sorry for the man. I mean, the man was seriously ill. Yeah.
The idea of rivalry seems to be missing from this. No?
Well, no, I think it's there. I think that's
How
why
does-
he was so oppressed.
Right, but in terms of this idea of leaderlessness and then you choose a leader, does he go into how that leader gets chosen? Are there rivals in this group, is what I mean, for the leader, for the...
That's not what he observes. That's not part of his theory.
Yeah, because you talk about pairing in this one, right?
Yes. But notably that when he's talking about pairing, he's saying the rest of the group, instead of feeling rivalrous, the rest of the group are rooting for these two people because they're hoping that out of their intercourse will come a third thing, a messiah who will lead them to the promised land.
Unless there are two pairs.
Well,
That's what I mean,
that he doesn't describe in
Right,
his
yeah.
observations.
Somebody must have brought that up
Right.
to him.
But, I mean, look, a Freudian would come more from that point of view. A Freudian would definitely be looking at combat and rivalry and battles and so on. But Bion is marking out some of his own creative territory here. Yeah.
In the group parameters where they elect, I think you said, or promote, or the sickest person
Yes.
in the group, why? I mean, what's going on there?
He doesn't
There's
explain.
this universal tendency to do this.
To do that.
It's
He doesn't
human
explain why.
nature.
He just says this is the way it is. He doesn't tell us why. I think that's a limitation in his theory. I mean, I'm glad he informed us that that's what he observes, but I would have liked if he'd had a bit of a theory as to why it has to go that way. But he doesn't
Because we do
provide.
see that, and it's very frightening.
Yes,
And-
it would be good to know why. Yeah, it would be good to know why.
I just to add to that, I've seen, I don't know, everyone's probably seen the same thing, but where you see narcissistic sociopaths who twist the truth, and then everyone buys it because their critical thinking skills aren't turned on.
Yes.
They don't want to be turned on potentially. There's something very complex, interesting going on. Yeah.
Well, I think, Bion is talking also, I mean, he contributes to the understanding of psychosis. because for him psychosis is an attack on our thinking apparatus. And it's, in the face of high anxiety and aggression that we can't turn outwards and we turn back on ourselves, it turns against our own thinking capability. We can't think. I mean, everyone has been in that kind of a fight or an argument where you are so enraged at what someone is saying to you or what they've done that you're sputtering. You can't put words together and you can't put thoughts together, right? So, yeah, I think that certainly happens. Okay, linking. I have a bit of a critique of Bion, his own one-sidedness. He conceives psychopathology as attacks on linking. And I say he's missed half the picture. I've got a paper coming out making this critique of Bion. Psychopathology is also attacks on separating. You see, like, he in seeing pathology as attacks on linking, he's defining mental health as linking up. But mental health is also separating out. Mahler, the task of the baby, separation, individuation. So there is the psychopathology of delinking, but there's also the psychopathology of linking. The psychopathology of linking is merging everything. Okay? Losing boundaries. Losing boundaries. Making everything the same. That's pathology. That's psychopathology, making everything the same. Making everything antithetically different is also psychopathology. Making everything so separate. Excessive boundaries, excessive linking. These are both forms of psychopathology. Bion has nailed the attacks on linking, but he left out the attacks on separating, it seems to me. And I think that's important. So after he did that work, observing the groups at that hospital, he then became a Kleinian analyst. And then he was able to rethink his observations in Kleinian terms, or map them onto the Kleinian model. So the work group, W, functions in D, in the depressive position. And in order for us to function in the depressive position in groups, we need to have structure. Here he fits with Freud's theory of group psychology. Freud and many of the social psychologists that Freud reviews in his book on group psychology and the analysis of the ego, 1921, I think, he reviews the work of Gustave Le Bon, Gabriel Tard, and McDougall, other social psychologists. And certainly McDougall makes the big distinction, and Freud follows him, between structured and unstructured groups. Structured groups avoid regression through the structure. They have a designated leader, they have a secretary, they have a treasurer, they have a flow chart for how authority functions. You have this task, you have this task, and we get the work done because we have structure. But when structure goes out the window, we get the unstructured group, which starts to behave in the way that Gustave Le Bon and Gabriel Tard and others are describing. Lynch mobs. These crazy eruptions and people behaving in ways they never would behave as individuals, but in a mob setting. They regress into the paranoid schizoid position. So the unstructured group tends to function in the paranoid schizoid position. The structured or work group hangs on to the depressive position. Okay. I did want to say a word about the grid. Okay, just a word. By the way, I wanted to highly recommend this book for those who want to know more about Bion. This is the best book I've come across on Bion. It's by Joan and Neville Symington, The Clinical Thinking of Wilfred Bion. Crystal clear explanation of Bion's thought. It's been around, 1996. It's really good. Here's what the grid looks like. So that's the grid. What is it? It's not, Bion does not sit in sessions classifying everything as to where it is on the grid, but it's a way of thinking of mental growth. And there are these two axes. There's the horizontal axis and the vertical axis, and that creates all of these different little boxes. The horizontal axis is concerns the genetic development of thoughts. Okay, again, it's a theory of thinking. And so he starts at the top with the most primitive thoughts, and as we go down, we get to the more complex types of thoughts. Thought is evolving, and it's becoming more abstract. So at the very beginning, the most primitive, you have pure beta elements. These concrete, unbearable, emotional states, the beta elements. And then above that are the alpha elements. And then we move up to dreams, dream thoughts, dreams and myths. And then we come to what he calls preconceptions. And then we come to conceptions. And then we come to a concept. And then we move on to a scientific deductive system. And then finally we wind up with an algebraic calculus. So he's studying the evolution of thought from these concrete beta elements through these growing levels of abstraction. And then on the vertical axis, if the horizontal concerns the genetic development of thoughts, the horizontal axis concerns the uses to which thoughts may be put. The uses to which thoughts may be put. The definitory hypothesis, notation, attention, inquiry, action. Okay, and so then you have all of these positions that represent the different positions of the intersection of these two axes. He's trying to talk about the evolution of mind, and he's also trying to talk about what's going on in the session. And the analysts attempt to see whether what is happening in the session is evolving progressively or devolving regressively. You know, he's trying to study whether the patient is engaging in mental growth or, you know, K or minus K. You know, is he moving in the direction of successful coupling of the sort that made that seminar so interesting and productive? Or is he going the opposite way, the way that disturbed student was destroying the thought process in the... and of course, in any analysis, you're going to have steps forward and you're going to have steps back. And this is an attempt to try to observe that to some extent. He's talking about working over the session after the session. He's not sitting there in the session doing this. That would be the opposite of coming into the session without memory or desire. This is for thinking about clinical material after the fact. And progressive movement is like a diagonal this way. Growing in complexity, and the uses are evolving, and we're going like this. But pathology could be going this way or this way. I don't think too many people have actually used this. Bion himself seemed to lose interest in it. Okay, this is his early thinking. I mean, you know, here's a parallel with Lacan. Lacan was fascinated with scientific numbers and algebra.
It's a very masculinist way of approaching things, I must say.
What's the something knot? What's the name of the knot?
The Gordian knot.
No, not a Gordian knot.
Not Gordian knot.
What's it? He calls it some other kind of knot.
It starts with the R. I'm resisting.
Yeah. Well, so there was all of this slightly pseudoscience stuff, you know. I mean, and Lacan was a structuralist, and like other structuralists, like Levi-Strauss, I mean, they were into science.
Well, it's the linguistic turn, and its marriage
Right.
in French theory in the post-Heidegger
Yeah, absolutely.
world that brought it all together.
It comes from de Saussure and
Yeah.
structural linguistics, which are
Benveniste.
taken over by Levi-Strauss in his anthropological studies, and Lacan takes this over. I mean, I find it very difficult to relate to all of those Lacanian diagrams and charts, although I have a certain fondness for my own charts, which are sometimes rather misleading, as you pointed out in one way. So Bion's a little bit into this, but then he seems to lose interest, and he goes off in other directions that I find far more interesting. Okay, I think that's about the best I can do for tonight, just to whet your appetite and recommend this book. It's very good. One more comment. The London Kleinians, who practically everyone in psychoanalysis represents as probably the most creative group of analysts over the last 30 years. I'm talking about Hanna Siegel, Betty Joseph, Ronald Britton, Edna O'Shaughnessy, John Steiner. These London Kleinians, they're all Bionians. They're profoundly influenced by Bion, especially his theory of the origin of pathology as failures of containment. And they have all elaborated on Bion. Donald Meltzer as well. And boy, what a creative group of people they are. And like Bion, much of their work is the detailed study of resistance. And their way of conceiving of resistance, well, John Steiner wrote this book called Psychic Retreats. And he's talking about how patients find a kind of a castle, a kind of a fortress, a defensive fortress, which protects them both against the anxieties of the paranoid schizoid position and against the anxieties of the depressive position. And this leads to stasis in analysis. This leads to impasse. The analysis comes to, it just stalls unless you can begin to understand this constellation of defenses that constitutes a retreat, a fortress. Harry Guntrip tried to get at this in some of his work. He wrote a wonderful paper called The Schizoid Compromise, where he described how certain schizoid patients love psychoanalysis because they get to see someone, they get to have a fairly intimate kind of an encounter with another human being 4 or 5 times a week, but they're on the couch, it's only 50 minutes, it's only 4 or 5 times a week, it's about as much intimacy as they can tolerate and stand, and even there they find ways of protecting themselves against intimacy. So anyway, these people have really contributed a lot to our understanding of resistance.
I have a question about the role of the father. That's I'm sorry. A question about the role of the father in non-Oedipal terms. Certainly in the last, I don't know, 20 years maybe, we've seen fathers taking on a more primary caregiving role, and I know the infant observation classes probably go through this, the workshops look at this.
Right.
I mean, I remember in my own life, for example, you know, my partner, father of our child, was critical in feeding and all of that. At day 5, day 6, and
Right.
so, you know, granted this is of its time, but is there...
When you say this, what are you referring to?
Well, a lot of the work that we're reading now and looking at it in these very conceptual ways,
Right.
very important, but the role
Right.
of the father in more nuanced and in caregiving ways, or are we to take the mother and as kind of a stand-in for caregiver.
That's the way I'm reading it.
Okay.
Always, yeah, for sure. I always think of how I felt when my son was a baby, and occasionally my wife would express some milk, and then she'd go out for a few hours, and he would wake up and be hungry, and presto, there was that little tube, and I could feed him, right? But sometimes he would consume all of that, and she would get delayed, and he'd wake up and he'd be wanting to be fed again, and I just didn't have it, right? And so it made me realize that's how Fairbairn described the father, the mother without breasts.
But I also think of other sort of like soothing stuff that the father is often able to do in ways that are very nuanced, very early in the first few weeks
Right.
of life, that the mother may not quite be able, or just the change that actually can halt and cause some interesting shifts in the infant
Right.
in terms of soothing them and changing. Maybe it's just the fact of being held and the father's body is hard,
Yeah.
and there's something else going on, especially
Right.
if it's a colicky baby.
Right. No, I think it's really interesting, that kind of research. I don't know, I find myself having to work hard to rescue myself from an element of lingering patriarchal ideology in me. I mean, I'm 72, so it's hard to purge oneself of that kind of stuff. But Erich Fromm, who I'm very interested in, was influenced by Bachofen's whole theory of mother right and all of this. And at one point in his thinking, he's distinguishing maternalistic values from paternalistic values. And I have to distance myself from that kind of thinking, because there's no particular reason to label sensitivity and empathy and nurturance as maternalistic, and boundary setting and whatever as paternalistic. I mean, one has to resist that, But that's quite a separate issue from the issue of the actual empirical study of the role of the father in early child care, for sure. But in some ways you could say that this whole course is an attempt to trace the shift from Freud's distinctly patriarchal focus, beginning with Ferenczi, to a whole new appreciation of the mother. I mean, Freud was just pretty much blind to the role of the mother, except as a target of Oedipal desire. And so Ferenczi and Bion with the whole containment thing, and certainly Winnicott tonight, we're very much emphasizing the importance of the pre-Oedipal and the maternal, which is not meant at all to deny the interesting thing that you're talking about, is study of the role of the father in early development. That's a whole interesting thing. Okay, let's turn to Winnicott. First of all, to let you know about a really good book, a biography by F. Robert Rodman, R-O-D-M-A-N, 2003. F. Robert Rodman, Winnicott, Life and Work. Really good book in some ways, although I'm finding it a bit annoying in other ways. He buys a little too much into the critique of Melanie Klein for downplaying the role of the real mother. I mean, Winnicott was very influenced by Klein, and there's a whole Kleinian side to Winnicott's thinking. But he turned away. He refused to contribute a paper to a book that was a collection of papers by Kleinian analysts celebrating Mrs. Klein. I don't know on what birthday, but it was kind of like a Festschrift, for, and he declined to publish this paper in that. He was not a part of the Kleinian group, although he was supervised by Klein. He became a member of the middle group, the independent group, rather than either the Freudian or the Kleinian group. Okay, 1896 to 1971. He died in 1971 at the age of 74. He had been a pediatrician first, and then became an analyst. His first analyst was James Strachey, and then he went on to a second analysis sometime later with Joan Riviere. Both Strachey and Riviere being Kleinians, basically, especially Riviere. Melanie Klein asked Winnicott to analyze her son Eric, so he analyzed Klein's son. He had supervision on many cases, many other cases. She didn't supervise him on the treatment of her own son, but she supervised him on many other cases. Eventually he kind of broke with Klein, and it really was over the issue of what he saw as her downplaying the role of the real mother. The thing about Winnicott is that he was like I mean, it sounds like a criticism, and it is a criticism in a way. He was a very unsystematic thinker. He never tried to pull his ideas together. He never tried to systematize them. In some ways, that was his strength. He gave himself permission to write up what he saw. And if the writing up of what he saw happened to kind of correspond with Kleinian thinking, then the result was a kind of a Kleinian paper. And if what he saw happened to suit something else, that's where he went. And you can't say that he started out as a Kleinian and evolved to something like a relational or self-analyst, because he zigzags back and forth. Like in the same year, he'll write something very Kleinian, and he'll write another paper that fits nowadays what we would see as a relational or self-psychology kind of paper. So it's kind of good that he gave himself permission to do that, because the result was a remarkable kind of creativity, you know. I mean, he wasn't hemmed in by a need. A very different mind than Freud's. I mean, if Freud was going to write anything up, Freud was terribly concerned about how what he was writing up now fit with what he said last year or 5 years ago. You know, he was always trying to be consistent and work out a consistent model, although he permitted himself to make major shifts as he went along, but different kind of mind.
Question.
Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that Winnicott was a little more focused on the unique character of the task as opposed to defining different persons' perspectives applied to that task?
Yeah. Yeah.
So he wasn't necessarily going out to be a Kleinian today.
Definitely not. No, he was going out to write up what he saw. And you know, I mean, he would get inspired by some observation, and he'd start to work on it, and pretty soon it would turn into a paper. And yeah, he really tried to. Okay, well, we're going to come to his concept of true self and false self. He tried to be faithful to his true self, and what his true self was playing with at the moment. And he gave himself permission to play without worrying about how this play was fitting into a more abstract theoretical frame. You know, I mean, he wasn't like, you can't say he wasn't an intellectual. He wasn't a theoretical intellectual. He wasn't a systematizing intellectual. He was more like an artist. He would see something and he would work it up. His papers are kind of more like, they resemble artistic productions in a certain kind of a way. The work of Heinz Kohut in self-psychology, parts of it sound like complete rip-offs of Winnicott. Some people have kind of suspected that Kohut was engaged in either plagiarism or cryptamnesia. Cryptamnesia is when you read someone or are impressed with it, you forget that you read them, and then you think that these ideas and words are your own. I'm not quite sure whether it's which it is, but certainly Winnicott got to much of what Kohut would later get to. But Kohut would get to it in a much more one-sided way, because for Kohut, that kind of self and relational thinking became pretty much the whole enchilada, whereas Winnicott was still a Freudian. I mean, at the end of his life, he wrote a book called Human Nature, which is a straight exposition of classical Freudian theory. Oral, anal, phallic, Oedipal. He writes this Freudian stuff. It's quite surprising because in some ways he's evolved very far away from the Freudian model, but at the end he's writing like a Freudian. He never lost touch with the Kleinianism. So maybe we should approach this chronologically. So it's in 1951 that he writes what some people would argue is his most important paper, the paper on transitional objects and transitional phenomena. So the transitional object is an object like Linus's blanket or the teddy bear, and you mustn't ask whether it's invented or found, whether it's real or imaginary, whether it's inner or outer. It has to be allowed to occupy this in-between space. In one place he calls it the first not me object, but at the same time it's the first me object. The thing about it is it's both me and not me. It's both mother and not mother. And you mustn't ask which it is. You must resist asking the either or. And it's this, and then he broadens from the transitional object to the transitional area. Now, it's important to understand that the reason he calls it transition, and many Winnicottians, I think, have lost touch with this. So I have a critique of what's been done with Winnicott in certain circumstances. He's calling it transitional because he feels that its purpose is to help the child effect a transition. And the transition is from an entirely subjective world to being able to cross over to the objective world. Now he remains, I believe, he remains to the end a Freudian in the sense that he shares Freud's idea that really, we need to face reality. And reality is harsh. T.S. Eliot says mankind cannot bear very much reality, because reality is we're dying. And much of facing reality is a painful task. And Freud really thought that one of the goals of analysis is to enhance reality testing. The ego is guided by the reality principle. And Winnicott basically shared this, but Winnicott had more compassion for human beings than Freud did. He thinks that people need holidays from reality testing. It's too much for us to take constantly. We need R&R. And so we need retreats into this transitional area. Okay. The transitional area is the area of illusion. Freud will say religion is a wishful illusion. Grow up, give it up. It's a crutch. Learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. Winnicott had a much friendlier attitude to religion. He doesn't deny that it's illusion. He shares Freud's attitude that it's wishful illusion. He just has compassion for our need for wishful illusion. Okay, so religion exists in the transitional area. The arts exist in the transitional area. So when we go to the movies, we go into a transitional space, which is why we hate it when the film breaks and the lights come up. Everybody go, ah! Okay, because we're reminded that it's illusion. So in order to appreciate the arts, theater, liturgy, if you're into religious practice. See, for a Winnicottian, going to church is pretty much the same thing as going to the movies. It's pretty much the same thing as going to theater. It is theater. So I identify with the Anglo-Catholic tradition, and boy, do they do theater well, some of these priests. I mean, 5 priests in unison, bowing and kneeling at the same time, making the same movements, it's pretty amazing. So religion takes place in the transitional area. Now, in order to be able to appreciate a film or a theatrical production or liturgy, you need to be able to engage in a willing suspension of disbelief. If you're sitting in the movie saying, "Oh, come on, it's just light being projected from behind me on a screen up there," you're not going to enjoy the film. I had a friend who suffers from an anxiety disorder, and it was like really a pain going to the movies with her because, she'd be constantly distancing in some skeptical way. Sometimes she'd actually have to get up and leave the theater because she couldn't take it. It was making her too anxious. But she was constantly distancing, reminding herself it was just a film as a way of controlling her anxiety. That's a failure of the willing suspension of disbelief. In order to appreciate, you have to do that. This is not so much a critique of Winnicott as it is an addition. I believe that, Winnicott doesn't say this, but I believe that in order to be in the transitional area, you must be able to be capable of a willing suspension of disbelief, but also a willing suspension of belief. You mustn't believe, nor must you disbelieve. That's why it's like the transitional object. You mustn't ask, is it invented or found? Imagine someone in a movie who believes someone on the screen is about to commit a murder, and he's running up to the screen to interfere, to prevent the murder from taking place. He's become a believer. That's psychotic. Okay? Therefore, there's a critique of the Roman Catholic doctrine of the transubstantiation here. I mean, you're supposed to believe that the wafer becomes Christ's flesh, and the blood, the wine becomes his blood. You're supposed to believe that, literally. To me, that's a failure of the willing suspension of belief. So there's two ways of falling out of the transitional area. Into belief or into disbelief. Bah humbug. Or I'm taking it literally. Okay? Total skepticism or total fundamentalist belief. Those are both failures of the transitional area. What are you doing when you're in the transitional area? You're enjoying the play. You're enjoying the play, but you're not believing it, nor are you disbelieving it. You're playing. That's what Winnicott is all about, play. Healthy people know how to play. They're able to play. Okay. When I said I don't like what some Winnicottians do with this, Division 36 of the American Psychological Association is psychology and religion, and there are many psychoanalysts there and they're real fond of Winnicott in Division 36 because unlike Freud, who sees religion as this thing we should cast aside, they have an appreciation of religion. But some of the people there interpret Winnicott to mean that somehow mental health resides in the transitional area, that somehow we should live there. We should live in the it's like we should go to the movies all the time. We should live in the theater. We should live in the church. We should play all the time. And that's mental health. Well, no. That's not Winnicott. Winnicott's too Freudian for that. Winnicott says the whole purpose of the transitional area is to help us be able to tolerate facing reality. Get back to work with science and facing objective and often painful truths. But we need these holidays into the transitional area. That's Winnicott. Okay. And he talks about the importance of transitional objects in child development. And some children who don't have transitional objects, that can often be a sign of trouble. I mean, these are kids who can't play. Sometimes they can't play because there's been premature adultification of the child, or there's been premature intellectual development in the child. There's been what we'll call false self-development. But a healthy use of transitional phenomena is usually a good sign in a child. Now, subsequent analysts have elaborated, like Frances Tustin worked with autistic spectrum kids, and she distinguishes what she calls the autistic object in contrast to the transitional object. The transitional object is often this soft, fluffy teddy bear kind of thing, or it's that soft bit of blanket that the child rubs against, and you mustn't wash it. If you wash it, you're destroying it, because it has to, have the torn ear and the missing eye and the smell. I remember my teddy bear had a terrible smell because I had the idea that somehow if I put it in the oven and baked it, I'd wind up with a giant gingerbread. It was all singed. But the autistic object is hard. It's like a pebble or some hard object that the kid clings to. And it has a function of warding off intense anxiety. It has a magical property. I suppose transitional objects do all have some kind of magical property. Linus's blanket, it has a kind of a magical soothing property. But the autistic object is something else that the child uses to ward off intense anxiety states. And its hardness is important. You'd have to read Tustin to get a deeper sense. That's about the best I can do to explain that distinction.
How would that relate to Kohut's self-object?
Oh, very different, because Kohut's self-object is not really an object at all. Kohut stopped talking about the self-object. He stopped talking about self-objects. Instead, he started talking about self-object function. People are not self-objects. People are providers of self-object function. Okay, so and Kohut, we'll come to Kohut later, so I don't want to take a lot of time on him now. But like in a relationship with someone, sometimes like a spouse. Like so my wife is both an object and a self-object for me. So if I've had a narcissistic injury and my self-esteem is a bit wounded, and I come home and I turn to her, I'm turning to her for self-object function. That is, I want her to soothe me. I want her to remind me that she thinks I'm a pretty okay guy, that that she loves me. Remind me of how good I am. Blah blah blah. I'm looking for self-object function. And once I've gotten the self-object function and I have reintegrated, now I can look at her as an object again. And now she's a separate person. And I can say, well, how was your day? After she's done 20 minutes of psychotherapy with me. I remember she's a person. How was your day? Suddenly she's a real person again. And so these are different dimensions. So these are different dimensions of relatedness. The self-object. The self-object is an object that provides needed functions for the self in Kohut. So this is quite different from either the transitional object or the autistic object. Okay. So the function of the transitional is to help us make this transition. So he means from the subjective kind of psychotic world. Okay, there's a connection here with Freud. Freud made in 1914, in that amazing essay, I'm always quoting from that essay, I suppose that's probably, for me, one of the most important essays Freud wrote on narcissism. In that essay, he also distinguishes two kinds of love. narcissistic love, and true object love. Now, what he means by true object love is seeing the object realistically, warts and all, and being able to do the work of loving, despite seeing the limitations and, you know. What's narcissistic love? Okay, in narcissistic love, the person I love represents me. Okay? It's not really love for another at all. It's love for myself. Because the person I'm loving narcissistically stands, Freud says, for the self that I once was, or the self that I now am, or the self that I one day hope to be. Okay? And so really it's a hall of mirrors. I think I'm in love with this person. I'm not realizing that this person just stands for me. So here's the best way to illustrate this, having lived in the university for so many years. It's very common for, you know, a middle-aged male professor who's having his midlife crisis to get involved with a young female graduate student who's like 25 years younger than him. And they fall in love. But it's completely narcissistic love. So what is she for him? The self that he once was. Young. Without the wrinkles. So he's trying to get his youth back. What does she represent for him? The self that she wants to be. It's a shortcut. He's already got he's got a bunch of books published already. She wants to take the shortcut. If she can get him, who's already an established scholar, to go for her, it's like she's elevated. Fast-tracked in a certain kind of psychological way. So he's trying to capture his lost youth. She's trying to capture the self that she would like to be. And the whole thing crashes. And, you know, so now he's knocking on his wife's door asking to be taken back. Doesn't work. It's narcissism. They're not even seeing each other. Really. So here's a story. This one I'll have to edit out. So this guy was in treatment with me, and he was having a flaming affair with a young woman in her early 20s. And she was like a Queen Street West girl, you know, long dresses, Doc Martens. She was very hip, and he was fascinated. And one night he's at home with his wife, and they're showing slides from their recent trip to Europe. And to his horror, they're showing slides to another couple, guests. They're showing slides. And to his horror, up on the screen, suddenly comes a picture of his mistress, his young mistress. And then he looks at it and he realizes that it isn't his mistress, it's his wife of 30 years before. Who's the spitting image of his mistress? He breaks it off with the mistress. He realizes he's been looking for his lost young wife and found her in this mistress. And then he realized that he didn't need the mistress. He could become a Queen Street dude. He could give up the house in Rosedale or whatever and get a fancy townhouse or apartment. Whatever. He could go out and buy himself some Doc Martens. He could start wearing black jeans. He didn't have to do it all through this girl, you know. So anyway, that's narcissistic love. To some extent, Winnicott is trying to talk about this very transition from narcissistic love, where everything is a hall of mirrors and everything is about me, to being able to see the other as an other, in all of their annoying otherness. Because the otherness of other people is annoying. It's also wonderful. It's both. And transitional objects are what help us make this difficult transition from narcissism over to the reality of the other, right?
How so, specifically?
You ask all the hard questions.
Sorry.
How so? How so? Well, I guess because it's in that intermediate area, because it allows you to not have to make the transition so abruptly. How are you going to leap all the way from the subjective narcissistic world all the way over to, it's like you need something in between to help you make the move.
But I'm wondering at, I don't know if you want, I'm just wondering at a level of, is it about, projecting and I mean, is it about the sense of play with the object and the unconscious or conscious connection or cathexis
Well,
that
I think
one has with it?
when you say is it about interjecting and projecting, I think you're onto something. I think that's the way I would go about trying to explain how that. Winnicott doesn't give us that explanation, okay? But that is the way a Kleinian would go about trying to make sense of what Winnicott has observed in terms of projection and introjective processes. That's about all I can say about that. Yeah.
I was just thinking, is it like it could be a fear of the unknown, and so to be able to tolerate that, you take a little bit and
Yes.
then you move back. And then you
Yes,
take
yes,
a little
yes,
bit
yes,
more,
yes. It's
and
like
you
a
move
small
back.
dose of reality and then a
Yeah,
retreat back and
Yeah, that's how I was.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So
Zone of safety.
Yeah, like just it's so abrupt, it can actually cause a lot of anxiety and be
Oh, totally.
overwhelming if it was to
that's right.
happen without those little steps.
Yes, baby steps. Yeah. I think that's right. I've often thought that the church is in a real bind. If we think about the church as a transitional area, and I do think that the church, for various people, helps them make a transition. Like, I found it very difficult to become a father. I put it off. I was 46 when I had my one and only child. And boy, did becoming a father make me anxious. So I headed back to church. Because there I was hanging out with fathers, albeit they wore dresses, but nevertheless, they were fathers. And I used to, take my kid in his snugly, and I used to love kneeling at the rail and having the priest put his hand on my kid's head and bless him. It was sort of like I was saying, help me be a father. This is overwhelming. I needed fathers to help me be a father. And it worked. It worked. But the problem is that they helped me make the transition, and then I didn't need them anymore. But they've got a problem as an institution because they need people to be coming year in, year out because they need people to pay for the new roof. They need people to pay for the heating system. So if you make a transition and you leave, I mean, like Wittgenstein talks about like a ladder that helps you climb up. And once you're up, you can throw away the ladder. So the church for me was something that helped me climb up. And then I could dispense with because it had become internalized, I don't have to deal with it in external terms. I mean, now anyone who knows my work could say, Carveth is still dealing with Jesus. That's his conscience thing. His whole introduction of conscience as distinct from the superego is bringing in, the Christian ethic in many ways. It doesn't have to be a Christian ethic. It can be an Islamic, Abrahamic ethic. But I don't need the external institution anymore. Church needs us to continue to need the institution. That's the problem. And on that level, you could say that it has a regressive. I'm glad it's there for people who need it. I needed it. I'm thankful to it. It helped me. But I don't need it anymore. I'm glad it's still there. Who knows? I may need it again. I may get the cancer diagnosis tomorrow, and I'll be lighting candles.
So this is definitely a phase rather than a position that you referred to in
Yes,
Klein.
yes, and thank you for saying that, because the other thought I wanted to convey was that towards the end of the book I did in 2013, I'm playing with the idea of trying to put Winnicott in between Klein's PS and D. Because it's too dualistic, it's too dichotomous, it's either PS or it's D. It seems to me that there's a transitional area in between PS and D, which again helps us make the transition, because that also is a painful transition from paranoid schizoid to depressive position functioning. I called it a conversion. It is. It's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or I mean Mr. Hyde PS, Dr. Jekyll D. That's so the transitional area, I think, fits in there. A few people are bringing Klein together with Winnicott in that way. There's a woman in New York, Susan Caviller Adler, and she just did a book on Klein and Winnicott, and she's trying to integrate Klein into Winnicott in this way. Okay, so that's 1951, Transitional Objects. So now, 1958, The Capacity to Be Alone. That's a really interesting paper. And now he's starting to move very much in a relational, well, the transitional is too, but this is markedly a step into relational self kind of thinking. The capacity to be alone. So he asks himself the question, you know, some people can't get any work done, and they can't be creative because they can't be alone. I mean, if you're going to be a creator, you got to sit in front of a blank page for long periods of time. Or if you're going to be an artist, you have to sit in front of a canvas in a room, you know. But a lot of people can't do that. They have to get up, they have to go for coffee, they have to check their email, they have to masturbate, they have to do something else. So you just watch kids in a library, like a university library. They sit for 10 minutes and they're up, they're good, they're going out to make a phone call. They can't. They got a problem, just being alone. So he says, what's going on with people who do have the capacity to be alone? These are people who, when they're alone, don't feel alone. That's how come they can be alone. They can be alone because when they're alone, they don't feel that they're alone. In other words, they carry inside them a soothing presence. They've got what Melanie Klein would say, a good internal object. That internal object soothes them, reassures them, calms them down, enables them to sit until the next sentence in the novel appears. Okay, how do you get that? He says, you get it through a million experiences as a child, sitting on the floor, in the presence of mother, who's sitting there. Now it could be father, you don't have to gender it. The caretaker is sitting there calmly reading the newspaper, knitting, doing a crossword puzzle, looking at her iPad. And the kid's playing, and the kid gets absorbed in his play to the point where he loses himself. He's not holding himself together. He's able to let himself go into the play. But then he wakes up, comes to, out of the play, and he's startled, he's anxious, and he looks around and, oh, there she is. Sometimes all he has to do is look at her and reference her, but sometimes he has to put the play down and go over and lean against her legs, maybe, and then slide back down to the floor, and then resume the play. A million experiences of waking up, finding her there, connecting with her, feeling soothed, going back to play. A million. She's being internalized. This calm. Now, it's a non-intrusive, non-abandoning. These are the two ways that the caretaker can fail the child. Intruding on the one hand, abandoning on the other. So that here, for some years ago at the Hinks, we had this, the Muirs. and we had the Watch, Wait, and Wonder program. Is your hand up, Michael?
No, no.
Okay. Watch, Wait, and Wonder. So this was infant psychotherapy. This was for mother-infant couples who just were all over, who just couldn't connect. So the feeding isn't happening, the sleeping is all off, and the mother and the infant are just having a nightmare together. So they go into this program, and the therapist gives one instruction to the mother. Get down on the floor with the child, and see the world through the child's eyes. Don't initiate play. Don't hand the kid a toy. Don't take a toy away and substitute another one. Don't intrude. And don't abandon. Be there with the child, crawling around, trying to see what the kid is doing through the kid's own eyes without interfering. Just following the child. That's training in empathy. That's all it is. It's training in empathy. And it's training the mother to restrain her impulses, to either intrude or drop.
What age was this? Sorry.
How old were those kids, Michael? They were pretty young, a lot of them.
First couple of years.
First few years, yeah. And the films, they filmed this psychotherapy. It was quite remarkable. You could see, in the first session, the mother and the infant, they were just like, they were all over one another's feet. You know, like the kid would want to pull back and the mother would move in. The kid would want to move in and mother would move back. They just weren't in sync, okay? And then after 1 or 2 sessions sometimes of this mother-infant psychotherapy, the thing turned around. You could actually see these kids finally getting in sync with their mothers and the mothers getting in sync with the kids. Okay, so the point for Winnicott is the caretaker must not be intrusive and must not be abandoning. You got to sort of thread that needle. Now, right there, Winnicott doesn't do this, but I'm immediately connecting this with what's been called the borderline dilemma. The borderline dilemma. I'm talking here about people, not necessarily just people who are labeled borderline. These are people who have this problem. They can't be in a relationship without feeling smothered, and they can't be out of a relationship without feeling abandoned. Read any of Sam Shepard's plays, Fool for Love. It's all about they come together, then they explode apart. In fact, in Fool for Love, in the play, Shepard in the stage directions takes place in a motel unit with a screen door on a spring, you know. So and a bass drum is hooked to the screen door. So when the screen door slams, boom, boom. So throughout this play, it's boom, boom, because they come together and they feel smothered, and so they explode apart. But they can't. As soon as they're apart, they feel abandoned, so they have to come together again. Boom, and they can't stand to be together, so they explode apart. So these are relationships in which I can't be with her, and I can't be without her. And so it's like a badminton shuttlecock back and forth, right? So that is the borderline dilemma. They can't be in without feeling engulfed. They can't be out without feeling abandoned. Anyway, Winnicott is addressing something here with the idea of the mother not intruding and not abandoning. And if she can thread that needle and be non-intrusive and non-abandoning, then the kid is not going to be stuck with this borderline dilemma. He's going to be able to be in without feeling smothered, and he's going to be able to be out without feeling abandoned. So now he can actually form a relationship without having to zigzag back and forth like this all the time. So this is how you acquire the capacity to be alone, through internalizing this non-intrusive, non-abandoning mother. And now and in many ways he's still being Kleinian here, because Klein's notion of how the child develops and how people benefit from analysis is the same. The cure is the building up of a good internal object, and having a good internal object. But in order to do that, you have to fight your way through all of the persecution fantasies and let go of defenses and start to trust, and then finding that much of the time your trust is well placed and the person comes through for you, the analyst comes through. I mean, there's a parallel between Klein and Kohut here. You know, both Klein and Kohut think that the cure is a process of internalization. Over time, internalizing the good object. People usually think Klein and Kohut are poles apart, and in some ways they are, but in this idea of what cures, and Winnicott is on board here as well. The cure is being able to internalize and build up this good, soothing, reliable, internal, loving presence. The good internal object. Then you can be alone, because you don't feel alone.
So, Don, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So, just like we shouldn't think of the paranoid schizoid process as a phase moving into depressive, to think about transitional space as a phase, it's a movement through let's say a space.
Yes.
But I'm thinking that you can keep that space the rest of your life.
Yes.
Because there's always a new version of reality every half hour. And it's not bad to have this lens to see it through. So I'm thinking of Margaret Mahler and object constancy,
Right.
and the child's inner working model, Bowlby,
Yes.
our cohesive sense of self,
Yes.
Kohut, all sort of being around the same arena that you carry with you.
Yes. 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 I think they're all sidling up on the same idea. Yeah. Yeah. That good internal presence or good internal object, or but I thought what you were saying was leading me to go in a slightly different direction. I mean, I think that's true, but I think, you know, like a Winnicottian would say that human beings have a need for ecstasy. Ecstasy meaning ekstasis. Standing outside, stepping outside. I think we need ecstatic experience. I used to find it at the Silver Dollar Room. For years, the Silver Dollar Room had a sign, the Silver Dollar outside, around the perimeter, that said, "Nothing but the blues." I'm a blues fan. And they used to bring great Chicago blues bands into the Silver Dollar Room. And I used to love sitting at that long bar. In those days, you could smoke. So I would be smoking cigars, drinking Jack Daniels, and listening to tremendous Chicago blues. And dancing, because they have a dance floor. The Chicago blues clubs don't have a dance floor. They just have sawdust on the floor, and you're packed in like sardines, and you hear great music, but you can't dance. So that was an area of ecstatic experience. The combination of the alcohol, the smoking, the incredible music, the sexy atmosphere of people dancing. Fantastic. Best times of my life. They knew me well there. That for some years they had the same bartender, girls, kind of tough women, but they called me the professor. And ran a tab, and it was great. So that's ecstatic experience. Some people find that by traveling to new cities and exploring. Some people find it by going to the ocean. I like the beach a lot. That's a transitional experience, the water and the beach. It's liminal. That's another term. That's not Winnicottian, but the whole idea of liminal experience. Right on the border of some two things, you know? It's neither nor. But so, ecstatic experience, church experience was ecstatic for me. Yeah.
So without going to talking in tongues and handling snakes.
Right.
You know that phrase, in the world but not of it.
Yes. In the world but not of the world. Right. That's exactly, do you know the work of the sociologist Peter Berger? Ah, okay. See, Berger talks about the conventional social world as a nomos, a named world. But people need, he's influenced by Heidegger, the idea that people need marginal experiences. And they need ecstatic experiences. And they define ecstasy as exactly this, ecstatic, stepping outside of the nomos, outside of the ordinary reality. We have to find ways to do that. I mean, obviously, people do it with drugs. They do it with alcohol. But there are lots of other ways of doing it. As I say, church, the experience of the arts. I mean, a good movie where you get lost in the movie, that is an ecstatic experience. You know, so I think we need these kinds of experiences. I think Winnicott is suggesting that. Yeah.
We're heading to a point, though, where you have to wonder, is there a pathology? Is there a potential pathology by being continually in transition phase, saying, okay,
Yes.
this is where I really love to be, and I don't want to...
Yes. That's what I meant earlier by these people in Division 36 who are enthusiasts of Winnicott's theory of religion, and they're interpreting Winnicott pretty much to say that we should build our tent in the transitional area and live there. And I'm saying, no, that's not Winnicott. Winnicott says, yeah, we need ecstasy, we need this, but the whole point of it is to help us move over and face reality and be able to tolerate truth. But we can't live with the truth all the time. We need to retreat into these wonderful experiences where there's ideal. Well, look, that's falling in love. Falling in love is an ecstatic experience. It's a little crazy, but who would want a life without that craziness? At least once, if not multiple times. Yeah. No, we can't live there all the time. It's a little bit crazy to try to live there all the time. Yeah. Okay, so that's the capacity to be alone. Okay, now that's 1958. Let's move up to 1960. Now we have true self, false self. His paper. These papers are amazingly brilliant papers. And they're short, a lot of them, you know. Anyway, true self. It's not easy to be clear about what he means by true self. At times it looks like he's associating the true self with the baby's simple somatopsychic going on being, almost like just his biological living is his true self. I think that's a bit of an oversimplification. In other words, the true self for me is irreducible to the biological living organism, that's for sure. The true self has connotations with authentic experience before falsification, before pretense. But he argues that none of us can live there. We're all going to have to develop some degree of a false self. You know, like in one of his famous aphorisms, Nietzsche says, yeah, people complain I'm hard to understand, you know, but I don't want to be known by just anybody, says Nietzsche, you know. I mean, you don't wear your heart on your sleeve, you know, you wear a mask. And we all have masks, and we all need masks. But unfortunately, some people get glued to their mask. And they lose touch with the fact that it's a mask. And what in fact is a mask, they take for their whole self. You know, they've lost touch with the true self. I mean, a healthy person still wears the mask, but he tests certain people, and when he finds them reliable, he takes off the mask. And he lets himself be known and vulnerable. Now, there's a problem here with Winnicott. Bring me back before we... why don't I just plunge into it and do the problem with Winnicott right now. Well, let me say just a little bit more about true self, false self. So he says, The development of the false self begins to emerge when the child's true self absorption in play, forgetting about himself, letting himself fall to pieces, letting himself be in pieces, letting himself just be. Something happens. He gets intruded on, or he gets abandoned. He becomes anxious. And at that point, he has to stop just being and has to start reacting. He has to react against the intrusion, or he has to react in the face of the abandonment. In other words, he has to start to look after himself because there's a failure. Well, Bion would say there's a failure of containment. Winnicott would say there's a failure of the holding environment to some degree. I think he would say these failures are inevitable. I mean, no parent could be good enough to prevent this from happening. On some level, he is going to have to start reacting, and he's going to have to start holding himself. But that is all the beginning of a false self. This is the self that is built out of the need to hold himself together. He's got to be together in the face of intrusion and abandonment. He has to manage himself. He becomes a self-manager. He's now got a managing self, a manager self, which is the false self. Sometimes this takes an intellectual form. He develops there's premature ego growth, premature intellectual functioning. I mean, I think he must have been hanging out around Cambridge and Oxford, and he met a lot of these schizoid intellectuals who are people with premature ego development and way over-intellectualized, and the schizoid intellectual who's out of touch with their feeling life entirely. You know what I mean? They could be brilliant mathematicians or whatever, but they, so he's talking about that as one form of false self-development, but there are all kinds of different forms of false self-development. But it's all grounded in some kind of disruption early on, some kind of something that has forced the kid to stop being and start doing and having. Now I'm making a link to Erich Fromm and Gabriel Marcel, who wrote a book called Being versus Having. So did Fromm. Neither of them wrote a book called Being versus Doing. Fromm was busy doing. The recent biography of Fromm is called The Lives of Erich Fromm, plural, because he was so busy doing. He had multiple lives. The guy couldn't relax. Being versus having. We're a culture which just isn't very good at being, right? What do we say to a person we're what do you do?
Unless you're in Montreal.
Unless you're in Montreal?
Yeah.
Oh, it's different there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's more about being.
Okay,
It
that's
was.
nice.
Yeah.
That's nice. Okay, so there's a shift away from being into, and that's false self-development, really. Yeah.
I do have a question which is about normative notions, like if it's normal or inevitable that certain things would happen and that there would be this shift from being into doing or managing the self to contain the self. Isn't this, I guess the word false is a little derailing in my own thinking because...
That's a bit dichotomous, isn't it?
Right, you're describing a normative kind of
yes.
concept.
And he's saying it's normative. He's saying everybody needs a false self.
Right.
But he's saying some people have lost themselves in their false self, and that's the pathology.
Because it would seem pretty critical to resilience. Everything you're describing.
Yes.
Is...
The ability to manage yourself,
yeah.
the ability to, yes, he would acknowledge that. He says we all need some degree of false self-development. He's just saying some people go way too far into it and lose touch with their true self altogether.
Okay, but if this happens in childhood, then, where is the true self? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think Winnicott would agree that I don't think it's ever extinguished. As long as you're alive, as long as you're alive and the blood is still circulating, because I'm not making my blood circulate, I'm not making my heart beat, there's something happening in me that I am not in control of, and somehow those physiological processes, it's very interesting. In meditative traditions, they get you to meditate on your breath. You're breathing, and because you're not making yourself breathe, you're breathing. So there is a somatopsychic element of the true self. As long as you're alive, something is going on. You're being. Meditative traditions, I think, are an attempt to get closer to that, to move away from the false self, to move more into that zone of being. So the child, I don't think, is ever going to entirely lose touch with it, but some people have lost themselves so far that it's practically almost... I like the church's attitude. The church's attitude is that no one is ever so completely lost that they can't be redeemed even in the last few seconds before they die. I mean, the church believes in deathbed conversions. I like that as a kind of a metaphor for the fact that the true self is never completely extinguished. Where there's life, there's hope. I guess is a way I would put it. But some people have become very, very false. So you know who's really good on this? R.D. Laing. He wrote a couple of good books before he got too drunk and nuts and stoned out on LSD. The Divided Self and The Self and Others. Now, The Divided Self by R.D. Laing is a really valuable book. It's about schizoid and schizophrenic persons. And he's talking about people who are really lost in a false self. And it made me think of things I've read about Marilyn Monroe, and the idea that in killing herself, she might have been defending her true self. Because she killed her body, which was owned by Hollywood. Hollywood colonized her. She was a thing, a Hollywood thing, an idol, a fetish. So she kills her body. And that could have been an act of affirmation of her true self. I think sometimes suicide can be an affirmation of one's true self. So here's a person whose whole body is taken over by the false self. So these are important concepts.
Sorry, what was the second book?
The Self and Others. The Divided Self and then The Self and Others by R.D. Laing, who was very influenced by Winnicott, by the way. Ronnie Laing was. Okay, then in 1963 we come to the development of the capacity for concern. That is a purely Kleinian paper. Now this comes 63. This is after true self. This is after capacity to be alone. So those are self and relational, the ones that we've covered. That's self and relational theory. Then he writes a Kleinian paper. The development of the capacity for concern is simply the move from PS into D. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about the development for the capacity for what Melanie Klein calls depressive anxiety in the depressive position. It's just a nicer statement of Kleinian theory in 1963. So you see, he hasn't gone from a Kleinian to a proto-self psychologist. He's got them all going at the same time. So let me come to the critique. We've got about 3 minutes left. 1963, this bizarre paper, Communicating and Not Communicating, Leading to a Study of Certain Opposites. Communicating and Not Communicating. So I've just written a paper critiquing that, because I think that what we see in that paper is Winnicott's own schizoid psychopathology. Now, I'm not saying anything. I think all psychoanalysts turn their personal psychopathology into theory. Freud had a doozy of an Oedipus complex, and he gave us Oedipal theory. Heinz Kohut was a major narcissist, and so he gave us self-psychology. So this is what Winnicott does. He says there is a part of us that must forever remain incommunicado. A part of us that no one can ever be allowed to see or touch. A private permanently non-communicating self that must never be known. This is paranoia. Why would you have this part of you that can never be known? Well, that's because you believe that if it were known, it would be destroyed. That's because you believe the other who would know it would destroy it. You see? And now, he was an Anglican. Well, he started out as a Methodist. He was raised in the Methodist tradition, but he was an Anglican. And that's bizarre because Anglicans in the Book of Common Prayer pray, Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open and from whom no thoughts are hid. Almighty God, unto whom all hearts are open and from whom no thoughts are hid. Now that for Winnicott would be a nightmare. Because that's a positing of an other to whom my heart is completely open and from whom none of my thoughts are hid. This is another who knows me completely. He knows me completely. Now that for Winnicott is a nightmare. Winnicott is saying that cannot happen. That's sick, in my view. That's schizoid. That's a residue of schizoid pathology in Winnicott to write that paper. Well, you know, someone should write about my residual psychopathology sometime. I have plenty. Everybody does. So this is not a knock on Winnicott. It's just saying, and of course it's creative on his part to take his psychopathology, even though he fails to see it as psychopathology. He put it into words. He wrote a paper about his psychopathology.
So, sorry,
We're out of
you're
time.
saying must as in the ought, so it's an ought, like must as a injunction against revealing,
Yes.
as opposed to this is the way it is ontologically.
Well, I think I don't know ontologically, I think he's saying this is a generalization. He's not saying this is just about Donald Winnicott. He's saying this is about all human beings. He's saying all human beings have a part of themselves that must never be known or seen by another human being.
As a should, is what it means.
Well, I don't know whether he's putting it as a should. I think what he's saying is that we all dread it. Forget the should. This is something we all dread. That to be human is to dread being fully known. And I think that's really sick. Because, you know, what are we looking for in love? What are we looking for? We're looking to find someone with whom we can completely disrobe, physically, psychologically, and just, you know, let ourselves be fully known. Now that requires what Erickson would call basic trust. And very few of us come out of childhood with basic trust. None of us have got perfect containment in Bion's sense. None of us have received perfect holding. None of us have escaped impingement and abandonment. So we all have existential, or what Bronnie Lang will call ontological anxiety. We all fear being known, and we fear being annihilated, and we're all a little paranoid and fear intimacy. But what is mental health? I mean, it's a matter of overcoming that fear of intimacy. You test the other person thoroughly before you open yourselves up to them, but the goal is to be able to open yourself up entirely to a trusted other. Not for Winnicott. We can never overcome our dread of that, as far as he's concerned. So he's saying full intimacy is an impossibility, is what he's saying. Okay, we got to hold it there.
Maybe it depends on how scary your skeletons are.
Uh-huh. The ones in the
And how
closet.
worried you are of acceptance. Maybe he had some really scary ones.
Well, you're right, it's about guilt. Skeletons is guilt, right? If you have a lot of guilt, how are you going to
Or
open
shame.
yourself, or shame, how are you going to open
Yeah,
yourself
from
up?
there.
Yeah, exactly.